The silence in my study usually tastes like success, but that Tuesday morning, it felt like a burial shroud. I was sitting at my mahogany desk, the one my grandfather shipped over from London in 1942, looking out over the manicured acres of our Greenwich estate. At 64, I had built sterling maritime and logistics into a titan of the eastern seaboard. I had the prestige, the legacy, and what I thought was the perfect family. I'd spent 40 years ensuring the name Arthur Sterling stood for something: honor, stability, and wealth. I was sipping my third coffee of the morning, reviewing a merger proposal, when the phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number. Usually I'd let it go to my assistant, but a strange prickle on the back of my neck made me pick it up. "Arthur Sterling speaking," I said, my voice carrying the practiced weight of a man used to being heard. "Mr. Sterling, it's Elena Vance." Her voice was a frantic whisper, thin and brittle like dry leaves. "I'm the lead photographer from Evangeline's wedding last month. Please, listen to me very carefully. You need to come to my studio in New Haven immediately. Come alone. Tell no one. Not your wife, not your daughters, and especially not your son-in-law." The air in the room suddenly felt heavy, as if the atmospheric pressure had doubled in a heartbeat. Elena Vance was a professional, a woman I had paid nearly $30,000 to document the social event of the season. She didn't do frantic. "Elena, what's this about?" I asked, my grip tightening on the phone. "Is there an issue with the prince?" "I wish it were just the prince, Arthur," she said, and the use of my first name told me the professional boundaries had already burned to ash. "I was doing the final digital touch-ups on the raw files last night. I found something catastrophic. I can't explain it over an unsecured line. Just come, please. If I'm right, your entire life is about to change." Before I could press her further, the line went dead. I stared at the handset for a long moment. My heart, usually a steady, reliable engine, gave a sharp, painful thud against my ribs. I didn't know it yet, but that 3-minute phone call was the sound of my world beginning to fracture. I thought I had built a fortress to protect my legacy, but I was about to find out that the calls were already coming from inside the house. I stood up to leave when the door to my study swung open without a knock. Only one person in this house was that entitled. Cassidy, my youngest daughter, walked in with a designer yoga mat tucked under her arm and a look of practiced annoyance on her face. At 31, she had the Sterling look, high cheekbones and piercing blue eyes, but she lacked the Sterling spine. She'd been living in my guest house for 3 years now, finding herself after a messy divorce that I had personally funded to the tune of $500,000. "Dad, finally," she sighed, dropping into the leather armchair across from me. "Did you talk to the guys at the dealership yet? The Mercedes is making this clicking sound, and honestly, it's embarrassing to drive. I told Jax we should just trade it in for the new G-Wagon. You said you'd handle the down payment this month." I looked at her, and for the first time I didn't see my little girl. I saw a woman who hadn't worked a day in 5 years, whose biggest stressor was a clicking sound in a car she didn't pay for. Behind her, leaning against the doorframe, was Jax Blackwood. Jax was a man who looked like he had been sharpened on a whetstone. He was Cassidy's partner of 2 years, a man with no discernible career, a collection of expensive watches he couldn't afford, and a smile that never quite reached his cold, gray eyes. I'd tolerated him because Cassidy claimed he made her feel secure, but every time he looked at me, I felt like he was appraising the value of the paintings on my walls. "Not now, Cassidy," I said, my voice sharper than intended. "I have an urgent meeting." "An urgent meeting on a Tuesday?" Jax chimed in, his voice a smooth, oily drawl. I thought the big boss was taking a step back. "You know, Arthur, if the stress is getting to you, I'm still waiting for that seat at the Sterling Maritime table. I could take some of the load off your shoulders." "The only load you're capable of carrying, Jax, is the one you're putting on my bank account," I snapped. I saw his jaw tighten, a flash of something dark and dangerous flickering in his eyes before he masked it with that hollow grin. "Dad, don't be mean," Cassidy whined. "Jax is just trying to help. We're family, aren't we? Family." The word felt like a bitter pill in my mouth. I brushed past them without another word, grabbing my keys. I could feel their eyes on my back as I walked down the grand staircase. They weren't looking at a father, they were looking at a vault, and I was starting to realize they were just waiting for the combination to change. The drive to New Haven took 45 minutes, but it felt like hours. My mind kept drifting back to the wedding. Evangeline, my eldest, my pride and joy, had married Julian Vane in a ceremony that cost me $250,000. Julian was the perfect son-in-law, an Ivy League graduate, a rising star in private equity, and a man who treated my daughter like a queen, or so I thought. The Vanes were an old money family from Newport, though their coffers had run dry decades ago. I'd been happy to replenish them to see Evangeline happy. Now, as the Connecticut coastline blurred past my window, a cold dread began to settle in my marrow. Elena Vance didn't call for no reason. The studio was located in a converted warehouse in a quiet corner of New Haven. Elena was waiting by the door, her face pale and her eyes rimmed with red. She ushered me inside and locked the door behind us. The studio was filled with oversized prints from the Sterling Vane wedding. Evangeline looked radiant in her Vera Wang gown. Julian looked every bit the dashing groom. It looked like a fairy tale. "I feel sick even showing you this, Arthur," Elena said, her hands trembling as she led me to a high-end workstation in the back of the room. I was sorting through the B-roll, the shots from the high-speed cameras we set up for the candid moments. Most of them are junk, just people blinking or mid-sentence, but I caught something. Something the cameras weren't supposed to see. She sat down and clicked a folder labeled Private. This was taken at 11:15 a.m., 2 hours before the ceremony, she explained. Most of the guests were still at the hotel. The wedding party was supposed to be in their respective suites. I had a remote-triggered camera set up on the second-floor balcony of the estate, testing the light for the bouquet toss. She hit the spacebar. The monitor filled with a crystal-clear image. It was a secluded corner of the estate's rose garden, shielded by a dense boxwood hedge. In the frame stood Julian Vane, still in his undershirt but wearing his tuxedo trousers. He wasn't alone. He was pinned against a stone pillar by a woman with fiery red hair. I leaned in, my breath catching. They weren't just talking. They were locked in an embrace so intimate, so visceral, that it made my stomach turn. Julian's hands were buried in her hair, his face pressed into her neck with a hunger I had never seen him show my daughter. "Zoom in," I whispered, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. Elena clicked. The image enlarged. I could see the sweat on Julian's brow. I could see the woman's face. She was laughing, her head thrown back in a moment of sheer, triumphant ecstasy. But it was her hand that stopped my heart. She had her hand pressed against Julian's chest, and on her ring finger sat a very specific, very recognizable piece of jewelry. It was a vintage sapphire and diamond ring. My ring, the one I had given to Cassidy for her 25th birthday. "That's not Cassidy," I breathed, my brain struggling to reconcile the facts. The woman had red hair. Cassidy was a blonde. The woman was taller, leaner. "Who is that?" "Look at the next shot, Arthur," Elena said softly. She scrolled. The woman had turned slightly. I felt the floor fall away beneath my feet. I knew that face. It was Sienna Blackwood, Jax's sister. The woman Cassidy had introduced to the family as her best friend and saving grace during her divorce. But the physical betrayal was only the beginning. Elena clicked to a third photo. In this one they had pulled apart. Sienna was holding a thick, manila envelope. She was handing it to Julian. In the corner of the frame, partially obscured by the hedge, was a third person. Only their hand and a portion of their arm were visible, but they were wearing a very distinct, custom-tailored suit jacket. A jacket I had seen Jax Blackwood wearing that very morning. "Wait," I said, my mind racing. Is she giving him money? Or documents? "Look at the metadata, Arthur," Elena said, opening a sidebar of code and timestamps. "The GPS tag confirms they were in the garden, but look at the file size of the digital burst. I have a video clip too." The camera was set to time-lapse mode. She played the clip. It was only 6 seconds long. Julian took the envelope, tucked it into the waistband of his trousers, and then leaned in to whisper something into Sienna's ear. As he did, he looked directly toward the house, directly toward the window where my daughter, Evangeline, was supposedly getting her hair done. He didn't look guilty. He looked victorious. Then, Jax stepped into the frame. He didn't look angry that his sister was kissing his girlfriend's brother-in-law. He slapped Julian on the back. They shared a laugh, a cold, conspiratorial sound that seemed to echo through the studio speakers. "They're all in on it," I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. The wedding, the divorce, the friendship. It's not a family. It's a syndicate. "There's more," Elena said, her voice dropping even lower. "I did some digging into the woman Sienna. Arthur. She's not a socialite. She's a high-level corporate paralegal for Vanguard Asset Recovery, a firm that specializes in hostile inheritance and contested estates. My heart went cold. I looked at the photos again, the perfect son-in-law, the best friend, and the partner, living in my guest house. They weren't just betraying my daughters. They were circling me like vultures, waiting for the exact moment to strike at the heart of Sterling Maritime. And then it hit me. If they were this coordinated, if they were this bold, what did they already have? I looked at Elena. Can you put all of this on an encrypted drive, every photo, every timestamp, every bit of data? I already have, she said, handing me a small silver USB. Arthur, be careful. If they're willing to do this at a wedding with 200 witnesses, they're capable of anything. I walked out of the studio into the bright afternoon sun, but I felt like I was walking into a blizzard. My daughters were either the victims of a massive, coordinated con, or they were part of the play. I didn't know which thought was worse. I got into my car and sat there for a long time, the USB drive heavy in my pocket. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. The man looking back at me was the man who had built a shipping empire from a single tugboat. That man didn't get angry. That man got even. I started the engine and began the drive back to Greenwich. I had a house full of vipers, and they were all waiting for me to come home and feed them. I would feed them, all right. But the menu was about to change. I pulled into my driveway and saw Jackson Cassidy lounging by the pool, sipping cocktails that cost more than most people's weekly groceries. They waved at me, smiling those bright, empty smiles. I waved back, my face a mask of grandfatherly exhaustion. Enjoy the sun while it lasts, I thought, because a storm is coming that none of you are prepared for. I walked into the house, but I didn't go to the kitchen or the living room. I went straight to my study and locked the door. I had work to do. I needed to see just how deep the rot went. I plugged the drive into my computer and began to look closer at the manila envelope in the photo. As I zoomed in, I saw a logo embossed on the corner of the paper sticking out. It wasn't a bank. It wasn't a law firm. It was the logo for the Sterling Family Trust, a trust that only I and my legal heirs had access to. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I picked up the phone and dialed my private investigator, a man I hadn't used in 10 years. "It's Arthur Sterling," I said when he picked up. "I need a full forensic sweep on my daughters, their partners, and my own CFO, and I need it yesterday. We're going to war." I hung up the phone and looked out the window. My phone buzzed on the desk. A text from Evangeline. "Hi, Daddy. Julian and I are coming over for dinner tonight. We have some amazing news to share. See you at 7. I stared at the message until the screen went dark. The amazing news. I could only imagine what it was. But one thing was for certain. By the time dinner was over, the Sterling family would never be the same again. The dinner table was set for 6, though only 5 of us were present. My wife, Eleanor, had been gone for 8 years. Her absence, a silent, echoing void that I had tried to fill with trust funds, designer handbags, and the kind of expensive education that teaches you how to speak perfectly without ever saying anything meaningful. I sat at the head of the table, staring at the empty chair at the far end, wondering what she would think of the vultures currently sharpening their knives over her fine china. I had spent 40 years building Sterling Maritime. I'd weathered the 08 crash, navigated shipping strikes in the port of Los Angeles, and outmaneuvered competitors who thought my old-school tactics were obsolete. I was a man of logic and logistics. But as I watched Julian Vane cut into his medium-rare Wagyu steak, I realized I'd ignored the most critical failure in my own supply chain, my daughter's judgment. Julian was a masterpiece of biological engineering, perfectly tailored suit, hair that looked like it belonged on a Roman coin, and a voice like aged bourbon. He had entered Evangeline's life 2 years ago, a Vane of Newport, a name that carried prestige even if the family accounts were more cobwebs than cash. I'd been so relieved to see Evangeline with a man of substance after her string of failed relationships with starving artists and adrenaline junkies that I'd welcomed him with open arms. I'd even helped him secure a partnership at a boutique equity firm. I thought I was investing in my daughter's future. I didn't realize I was paying for my own execution. "Arthur," Julian said, lifting his wine glass, a 2005 Chateau Margaux I'd pulled from the cellar specifically to see if he'd have the gall to drink it while lying to my face. "This is spectacular. You always did have the best eye for the finer things." "The finer things usually come with a high price tag, Julian," I replied, my voice as dry as the wine. "You just have to decide if they're worth the maintenance." Beside him, Evangeline beamed. She looked so much like her mother it ached the same soft curve of the jaw, the same light in her eyes. But Eleanor had a core of tempered steel. Evangeline had a core of expensive lace. She saw what she wanted to see. She saw a prince. She didn't see the man who, 2 weeks ago, had been sweating against a pillar with another woman in my rose garden. "Anyway, Daddy," Evangeline said, her voice trilling with that practiced Greenwich excitement. "We have the most incredible news. Julian and I have been looking at the Kensington estate, you know, the one on the bluff near the yacht club. It finally hit the market. It's a bit of a fixer-upper, but Julian says the bones are magnificent." "A fixer-upper?" I asked. "The Kensington estate is listed at $12 million, Evangeline. It doesn't have bones. It has a marble exoskeleton." "Exactly," she laughed, oblivious. "But to really secure it, we need to move fast. The market is insane right now, we were hoping." "Well, Julian has a lot of capital tied up in a new offshore venture, and we were thinking you could help us bridge the gap. Just a small down payment, $500,000. It would mean the world to us to start our real life in a home that matches the sterling name." $500,000. Delivered with a smile, as if she were asking for $20 for a movie ticket. My mind flashed to the manila envelope in the wedding photos, the one Sienna Blackwood had handed Julian. If Julian had capital tied up, why was he taking envelopes from corporate paralegals? Across the table, Cassidy and Jax were watching the exchange with an intensity that bordered on predatory. Jax hadn't touched his vegetables. He was leaning back, his gray eyes darting between Julian and me, like a spectator at a tennis match where he'd bet the house on the underdog. $500,000 is a significant bridge, Evangeline, I said. Especially considering the wedding costs were nearly that much. "Oh, come on, Arthur," Jax interjected, his oily drawl cutting through the tension. "What's $500,000 to a man who just closed the Wilmington port deal? You can't take it with you, right? Better to see your girls happy while you're still around to enjoy the view." I looked at Jax. This was the man who had been living in my guest house for 3 years, consulting on projects that didn't exist. He was a parasite, but a clever one. He had positioned himself as Cassidy's protector, the only one who understood her sensitive nature. He'd slowly isolated her from her old friends, making himself the center of her universe. "You seem very invested in my finances tonight, Jax," I said. "Did you finish that market analysis I asked you to look at 3 weeks ago?" Jax didn't blink. "Working on it, Arthur. These things take time if you want them done right. Quality over speed, as you always say." "I also say that time is money," I retorted, "and you've been on the clock for 3 years. Cassidy huffed, setting her fork down with a sharp clack. "Dad, why do you always have to make it about work? We're trying to have a nice family dinner. Evangeline is trying to build a life, and Jax is trying to help. Why can't you just be happy for us?" I looked at my youngest. She was the one who had introduced Sienna Blackwood to the family. Sienna, my soul sister, she mauled her. The only one who helped me get through the divorce. I wondered now if the divorce itself had been part of the play. Had they targeted Cassidy first? Used her vulnerability to get a foot in the door of the Sterling estate? I didn't know it yet, but I was looking at a masterpiece of social engineering. They had mapped my family's weaknesses, Evangeline's vanity, Cassidy's insecurity, and tailored their roles to fit perfectly. "I am happy when my children are secure," I said, choosing my words with surgical precision. "But security isn't just about the house you live in. It's about the people you share it with. Julian, how is that offshore venture going? The one with the unusual documentation?" Julian's hand stilled on his wine glass. Just for a microsecond. If I hadn't been looking for it, I would have missed it. "It's standard private equity, Arthur. High risk, high reward. But the legalities are ironclad. I've had my best people on it." "I'm sure you have," I said. "I've heard good things about Vanguard Asset Recovery. They're very thorough with legalities." The air in the room didn't just get cold, it froze. Julian's eyes met mine, and for the first time, the mask slipped. There was no warmth there, no son-in-law affection. There was only the cold, hard calculation of a man who realized he might have been spotted. "I'm not familiar with that firm," Julian said, his voice flat. "Really? I could have sworn I saw their logo on some paperwork recently." I lied, leaning back and taking a slow sip of my coffee. But then again, my eyes aren't what they used to be. "Old age, you know. You're as sharp as ever, Dad," Evangeline said, trying to bridge the sudden silence. "So, about the Kensington place? Can we count on you?" "The builder needs an answer by Friday." I looked around the table, 4 vipers and my 2 daughters, who were either the bait or the accomplices. I felt a surge of grief so profound it almost choked me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the table and show them the photos right then and there. I wanted to kick Jax into the driveway and tell Julian to never darken my door again. But I had built a shipping empire. You don't win a war by charging into an ambush. You win by cutting off the supply lines. I'll need to review the trust allocations, I said, my voice steady. I can't just move $500,000 without checking the tax implications. Give me a few days. I'll have an answer for you by the weekend. That's all we ask, Arthur, Julian said, the prince persona sliding back into place. We just want what's best for the family legacy. The rest of dinner was a blur of hollow laughter and expensive wine. I watched them perform. I watched the way Jax leaned over and whispered something to Julian while they thought I was looking at the dessert menu. I watched the way Sienna, who wasn't even there, seemed to haunt the periphery of the conversation. When they finally left, the house felt larger and emptier than it ever had. I stood in the foyer, watching the taillights of Julian's Porsche and the headlights of the Mercedes I'd paid for disappear down the long, winding drive. I turned and walked back to my study. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in the darkness, the only glow coming from the digital clock on my desk. 11:45 p.m. My phone buzzed. It was a private message from my investigator, Miller. He was a man of few words, mostly because words left a trail. Forensic sweep on the Sterling Family Trust is underway. You were right, Arthur. There have been 3 unauthorized queries into the principal balance in the last 60 days, all originating from an IP address registered to a shell company in the Caymans. The owner of that shell company, a man named Silas Vane, Julian's father. The Vanes weren't just broke. They were a criminal enterprise, and they weren't just waiting for me to die. They were actively looking for a way to drain the accounts while I was still breathing. But then, another message popped up. And Arthur, you might want to check the security feed for the guest house. Specifically, the back entrance. About 20 minutes ago. That's... I opened my laptop, my heart hammering against my ribs. I pulled up the in-crew hours feed for the guest house. This was the house Cassidy and Jax lived in. The safe space. The footage was grainy but clear enough. A car had pulled up to the back gate. Not Julian's. Not the Mercedes. A black SUV. A woman stepped out. Even in the shadows, that fiery red hair was unmistakable. Sienna Blackwood. She didn't knock. She had a key. She walked into the guest house. 5 minutes later, Jax came out to meet her. They stood in the shadows of the porch. They didn't look like siblings. They didn't even look like friends. They looked like partners in a long con. Jax handed her a folder, a thin blue folder I recognized instantly. It was the original deed to the Sterling Maritime headquarters in Manhattan, a document that was supposed to be in my private safe. My hand shook as I gripped the mouse. Jax had stolen the deed. But why? You can't sell a building you don't own. Then I saw it. Sienna opened the folder and pulled out a stamp. She pressed it onto the bottom of the document. Even through the low-resolution video, I knew what it was. A notary seal. They weren't just stealing my money. They were forging my signature to transfer the ownership of my life's work to a company I'd never heard of. I leaned back in my chair, the coldness in my chest turning into a white-hot flame of pure, unadulterated rage. They thought I was a senile old man who wouldn't notice a few missing papers. They thought I was a piggy bank they could smash and empty. What happened next changed everything. I didn't call the police. I didn't call my daughters. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in 20 years. A man who specialized in asset liquidation of a very different kind. It's Sterling, I said, my voice a low growl. I have a problem. It's 4 people. I need them dismantled, not killed. I want them to watch as I take back everything they think they've stolen. And I want them to end up with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a debt they can never repay. That's a tall order, Arthur, the voice on the other end replied. That's going to cost. I don't care about the cost, I said, looking at the photo of Eleanor on my desk. I want them to regret the day they ever heard the name Sterling. I hung up the phone and stared at the screen. The open loop in my mind was spinning faster and faster. Jax had the deed, Julian had the trust queries, Sienna had the seal, but I had something they didn't. I had the truth, and in 48 hours, I was going to serve it to them for breakfast. I didn't know it yet, but the $500,000 down payment Evangeline had asked for wasn't for a house. It was the final piece of the puzzle they needed to trigger a mental incompetence clause in my own trust. If I signed that check, I wasn't just giving her money. I was signing away my legal right to my own life. I looked at the blue folder on the screen, my eyes narrowing. Checkmate is coming, children, I thought. And you're playing against the man who built the board. The morning sun hit the mahogany of my desk like a spotlight on a crime scene. I didn't sleep. You don't sleep when you realize the people you've spent 30 years protecting are measuring you for a coffin while you're still breathing. I spent the pre-dawn hours staring at a copy of the Sterling Family Trust, specifically Article 12, Section 4, the Cognitive Safeguard Clause. It was a standard piece of legal architecture designed to protect the estate from the ravages of dementia or senility. It stated that if the grantor me showed patterns of irrational financial distribution or diminished executive capacity, a designated conservator could take over the day-to-day management of Sterling Maritime and its assets. The trigger was a single expenditure exceeding $450,000 made without a prior 3-month cooling-off period. By asking for $500,000 for the Kensington estate, Evangeline wasn't just asking for a house. She was handing Julian the keys to my kingdom. All they needed was for me to sign that check, and then they would present a concerned medical opinion, and I already knew who the doctor would be. Dr. Silas Vane, Julian's uncle, a man whose medical license was as polished and hollow as the Vane family crest. I looked at the silver-framed photograph on my desk. It was taken 20 years ago at our summer home in Martha's Vineyard. Evangeline was 12, her hair in messy braids, holding up a bluefish she'd caught herself. Cassidy was 7, sitting on my shoulders, laughing so hard she'd nearly fallen off. I was younger, stronger, convinced that if I just worked hard enough, if I just built a big enough wall of gold around them, they would be safe. I had failed. I hadn't built a wall. I'd built a gilded cage, and I'd forgotten to teach them how to fly. I had raised them to believe that the world owed them comfort, and in doing so, I had made them the perfect prey for men like Julian Vane and Jax Blackwood. Or perhaps, and this was the thought that made my chest feel like it was being crushed by a hydraulic press, they weren't the prey at all. Perhaps they were the hunters. I didn't know it yet, but the betrayal went deeper than a forged deed or a manipulated trust. I was about to find out that the clicking sound in Cassidy's Mercedes wasn't a mechanical failure. It was a tracking device. At 8:30 a.m., there was a knock on my study door. It wasn't the tentative, respectful knock of my house staff. It was the sharp, rhythmic rap of Julian Vane. "Arthur, are you in there?" His voice called out, oozing that manufactured warmth. "Evangeline said you were feeling a bit under the weather last night. I thought I'd bring by some of that specialty green tea you like from the city." I closed the folder on the trust and took a deep breath. I had to play the part. I had to be the aging lion. Slightly confused, grateful for the attention. I unlocked the door. Julian walked in, looking like he'd stepped out of a Ralph Lauren advertisement. He was carrying a small white bag from a boutique tea shop in Manhattan. "You look tired, Arthur," Julian said, his eyes scanning my desk with a predatory quickness he thought I was too old to notice. "Late night with the spreadsheets?" "The numbers don't lie as well as people do, Julian," I said, forcing a faint, weary smile. "Sit. Tell me more about this Kensington place." "Evangeline is quite convinced it's the only house in Connecticut that will suit her." Julian sat, crossing one leg over the other. "It's about the future, Arthur. The Vane and Sterling names. They mean something. A house like Kensington isn't just a residence, it's a headquarters. It's where the next generation will be raised. I've already spoken to the architects. We're planning a wing specifically for you. You won't have to worry about a thing." A wing, he meant a gilded cell, a place where they could keep the eccentric Arthur Sterling tucked away while they liquidated his life's work. "And the down payment?" I asked. "You mentioned $500,000? "Exactly," Julian said, leaning forward. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "The seller is being difficult. He wants cash up front to secure the holding. If we can get the check cut today, I can have the contract signed by noon. I've already brought the authorization forms, just a formality for the trust records." He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It wasn't a standard bank check. It was a supplementary expenditure authorization. My hand moved toward the pen on my desk, then hesitated. I looked Julian straight in the eye. "Tell me, Julian, how is your sister Sienna? I haven't seen her since the wedding." The silence that followed was so thick you could have carved it with a scalpel. Julian didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He was a professional. "Sienna?" he asked, his brow furrowing in a perfect imitation of confusion. "Arthur, I think you've got your families crossed. Sienna is Jax's sister, not mine." Though, after the wedding, I suppose we're all one big happy family now, aren't we? The lie was so smooth it almost made me doubt my own eyes. But I had the photos. I had the video of them in the garden. I had the metadata. Of course, I said, rubbing my temples as if I were struggling to remember. Jax's sister. Right. My apologies, Julian. My mind. It's been wandering lately. I keep seeing things that aren't there. A flash of triumph crossed Julian's face. It was subtle, a slight softening of the jaw, a glint in his eye. He thought he'd won. He thought the cognitive safeguard was already in effect. It happens to the best of us, Arthur, he said, pushing the paper closer to me. The stress of the company, the weight of the legacy, it's a lot for one man to carry alone. That's why we're here. To take the load off. Just sign here and we'll handle the rest. I picked up the pen. My fingers brushed the paper. I could see the ink glisten. This was the moment. If I signed, I was officially irrational. If I didn't, the war moved into the light. Before the nib touched the paper, my phone on the desk erupted with a high-priority alert. It was the security system for the Sterling Maritime server. Critical alert. Unauthorized access attempt. Encryption key 7 compromised. Origin. Internal Terminal 42. Terminal 42 was the computer in my own library, downstairs. I stood up abruptly. I need to check on something, Julian. Stay here. I'll be right back. Arthur, wait the check, Julian said, his voice losing some of its bourbon smoothness. The check isn't going anywhere, Julian. I snapped. The old Arthur Sterling, flickering back to life. Neither are you. I hurried down the hallway toward the library. My heart was a frantic drum in my chest. If they were into the internal servers, they weren't just looking for money. They were looking for the shipping manifests, the classified routes we used for high-value cargo. Those manifests were worth 10 times what was in my bank accounts if sold to the right competitor. I burst into the library. Jax Blackwood was sitting at the Oak Terminal, his face illuminated by the blue glow of the screen. He was wearing a headset, his fingers flying across the keys. He didn't even look up when I entered. Jax, I roared. What the hell are you doing on my secure line? Jax leaned back, a slow, mocking grin spreading across his face. He didn't look like the helpful consultant anymore. He looked like a wolf who had finally cornered the sheep. Relax, Arthur, he said, clicking a final button. I'm just doing some housekeeping. You know how cluttered these old systems get. I'm just archiving some files for you. Get away from that desk, I said, moving toward him. Suddenly, a hand caught my arm. It was Cassidy. She had been standing in the shadows by the bookshelves. Her eyes were wet, but her grip was surprisingly strong. Dad, stop, she whispered. Jax is just trying to protect us. He told me everything. He told me about the offshore accounts you've been hiding. He told me you were planning to cut us out of the will and leave everything to some foundation. I stared at my daughter, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. They hadn't just deceived her. They had weaponized her against me. They had fed her a narrative that I was the villain, the senile old man who was betraying his own blood. Cassidy, that's not true, I said, my voice shaking. He's lying to you. I have proof. Proof like the photos you've been hiding in your study? Jax interrupted, standing up from the terminal. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. It was a printout from the wedding. The photo of Julian and Sienna. You've been spying on us, Arthur. You've been looking for reasons to hate us. Cassidy, tell him. We know about the investigator, Dad. Cassidy said, a sob breaking through her voice. We know you've been tracking our cars. How could you? After everything we've been through since Mom died. We're your family. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. They had found my countermoves and turned them into symptoms of my paranoia and cruelty. I'm sorry it had to come to this, Arthur, Julian said, appearing in the library closed. He was holding the tea bag he'd brought earlier, but he wasn't offering it. He was holding it like a trophy. But we can't let you destroy the Sterling legacy because of your delusions. I've already called Dr. Thorne. He's on his way. He's going to help us get you the care you clearly need. I looked from Julian to Jax to Cassidy. I was trapped in my own home, surrounded by people who had spent months orchestrating my downfall. They had the medical help coming. They had the unauthorized financial moves ready to be blamed on my confusion. But as I looked at the terminal Jax had just used, I noticed something he hadn't. A small, green light was flickering on the bottom of the screen. Mirroring complete. Backup drive. Marcus is active. They thought they were deleting my files. They didn't realize I had a secondary, Air-gapped server hidden in the wine cellar, one they didn't even know existed. Every keystroke Jax had made, every file he'd accessed, had just been copied to a drive that was currently being uploaded to my private investigator's cloud. I looked at Julian, and for the first time in 24 hours, I felt a genuine smile touch my lips. "You're right, Julian," I said, my voice dropping to a calm, deadly quiet. "The stress has been too much. I think I will take that care. But before the doctor arrives, I have one question." "What's that, Arthur?" Julian asked, his confidence returning. "Did you really think I'd leave the override codes for the trust on a computer in the library?" The color drained from Julian's face. He turned back toward the terminal, his fingers hovering over the keys. "What are you talking about?" Jax snapped. "I just moved the primary access keys." "No, Jax," I said. "You just moved the decoy keys." The real access keys to the Sterling family trust are tied to a biometrically locked vault, and that vault only opens if my heart rate is within a certain range. If I'm distressed, if I'm under duress, it locks for 72 hours. I stepped closer to them, my eyes blazing. "You have exactly 10 minutes before the perimeter security I just silently triggered locks every gate on this estate. And when those gates lock, they don't open until the Greenwich police and my legal team arrive." Jax lunged for me, but I didn't move. I didn't need to. What happened next, I whispered to the empty air of the library, changed everything. Because at that exact moment, the front doors of the estate burst open. But it wasn't the police. It wasn't the doctor. It was Sienna Blackwood, her red hair disheveled, her face a mask of pure terror. "Julian, Jax," she screamed, her voice echoing through the grand hall. "Stop. We have to go. Now." "Sienna, what is it?" Julian shouted, stepping toward her. "It's not just the investigator," she sobbed, clutching a tablet in her shaking hands. "The feds are at the office. They're looking for the Vane entity. They have the manifests, Julian. They have everything." I watched as the three of them froze. The perfect plan was disintegrating in real time. But as I looked at my daughter, Cassidy, I saw the most terrifying thing of all. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look scared. She looked at Sienna, then at me, and a cold, slow smile spread across her face. "Oh, Dad," she whispered. "Did you really think I was the weak one?" I realized then, with a sickening jolt, that I had been wrong about who was leading whom. The Vipers weren't just in my house. They were my own blood, and the real betrayal was only just beginning. I looked at the girl I'd raised, the one who had cried when she scraped her knee at 7, and realized the blood in her veins wasn't just Sterling, it was ice. Cassidy's smile didn't falter as the chaos swirled around her. While Julian was hyperventilating and Jax was frantically trying to scrub the terminal, my fragile youngest daughter stood perfectly still, looking at me with a detached, clinical curiosity. "You always underestimated me, Dad," she said, her voice dropping the whiny, entitled register she'd used for years. "You thought I was the weak one because I didn't want to spend my life staring at shipping manifests and port schedules. You thought I needed finding. Well, I found myself. I found that I'm quite good at managing people. Much better than you." I felt a coldness settle in my stomach that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "You brought them here," I whispered. "Jax, the veins. This wasn't an intrusion. It was an invitation." "Jax is a tool, Dad. A blunt one, but effective," she said, glancing at the man who was currently sweating through his custom-tailored shirt. "And the veins? They were a necessity. We needed the prestige of the name to bypass the trust's secondary audits. Julian is a coward, but he's a Vane. That carries weight with the board of directors. Or it did, until Sienna decided to lose her nerve." Sienna was still by the door, her chest heaving. "Cassidy, the office is gone. They're seizing the servers. If they find the link between the Vane entity and the Sterling Maritime headquarters transfer—" "Shut up, Sienna," Cassidy snapped. The authority in her voice was absolute. "The servers are encrypted. The only thing they'll find is a trail of breadcrumbs leading straight back to Julian's father in the Caymans. We are fine, as long as Dad signs the authorization." "I'm not signing anything," I said, my voice vibrating with a rage I could barely contain. "I've already triggered the security lockdown. You're trapped." "Trapped?" Cassidy laughed, a short, sharp sound that felt like a slap. "Dad, who do you think updated the security software last year? Who do you think hired the new cybersecurity firm that manages the estate's perimeter? Jax didn't just stumble into your library. He's been the administrator of your digital life for 18 months. I looked at Jax. He stopped typing and leaned back, his confidence returning. He tapped the side of the monitor. The lockdown you think you triggered? It didn't go to the police, Arthur. It went to a private security firm in New Jersey. My firm. They're 10 minutes out, and they aren't here to arrest us. They're here to secure the property while you undergo your medical evaluation. I didn't know it yet, but the trap hadn't just been set. It had been bolted to the floor. Every move I'd made to protect myself had been monitored, intercepted, and repurposed to fuel their narrative of my declining mental state. And here's the best part, Jax continued, his grin widening. The forensic sweep your investigator Miller is conducting. He's not working for you anymore, Arthur. He's been on my payroll since the Wilmington deal. Every leak he gave you about the veins was exactly what we wanted you to see. We needed you paranoid. We needed you acting erratically. The room tilted. Miller, a man I'd trusted for 2 decades. If he had flipped, then every piece of intelligence I had was a lie. The vein entity, the feds, the Caymans, it was all a hall of mirrors designed to keep me running in circles while they tightened the noose. Why? I asked, my voice cracking. I would have given you everything eventually. Eventually isn't soon enough, Cassidy said, stepping closer. I'm 31, Dad. I don't want to wait until I'm 50 to have a life that isn't dictated by your sterling values. I want the liquidity now. I want to sell sterling maritime to the Baltic Syndicate and never have to look at a shipping container again. The Baltic Syndicate? I gasped. They're pirates. They'll dismantle the company. Thousands of families depend on those jobs. Then they should have worked for a more stable employer. She shrugged. The sound of tires on gravel echoed through the open library windows. 2 black SUVs pulled up to the front entrance. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. The medical team. That will be Dr. Thorne, Julian said, straightening his tie and regaining his composure. And the security detail. Arthur, for your own sake, don't make a scene. It will only make the diagnosis easier. The library doors opened, and a man in a sharp gray suit entered. He didn't look like a doctor. He looked like an undertaker. Behind him were 4 men in tactical gear, their faces expressionless. Mr. Sterling, the man said, his voice cold and professional. I'm Dr. Alistair Thorne. Your daughter and son-in-law have expressed grave concerns regarding your recent behavior, accusations of spying, tracking family members, and making unsubstantiated claims about criminal conspiracies. For your safety, we're going to conduct a brief assessment. This is a kidnapping, I said, looking at the guards. I am perfectly sane. They are trying to steal my company. Dr. Thorne sighed, a practiced sound of pity. Paranoia, grandiose delusions of persecution. It's a common symptom at this stage. Please follow my associates to the sunroom. We've set up a mobile clinic. One of the guards stepped forward, his hand moving toward my elbow. I pulled back, my eyes darting toward the desk, toward the hidden button that should have opened the secret compartment in the floor. But I knew now it wouldn't work. I was a king in a castle where the guards had all been replaced by the enemy. Wait. A voice called out from the hallway. Evangeline walked into the room. She was pale, her eyes wide as she took in the scene, the guards, the doctor, the shattered glass on the floor. She looked at Julian, then at Cassidy. What is this? She asked, her voice trembling. Julian, you said we were just going to talk to him. You said the doctor was just for a consultation. Why are there men with guns in our house? Evie, sweetheart, go back to the living room, Julian said, his voice dripping with that fake honey. Dad's had a breakdown. We're just getting him the help he needs. A breakdown? Evangeline looked at me. Daddy, is that true? Evangeline, look at them, I shouted. Look at Jax. Look at the doctor. They're trying to declare me incompetent so they can sell the company to the Baltics. Julian has been cheating on you with Sienna since before the wedding. Evangeline froze. She looked at Julian, then at Sienna, who was still standing by the bookshelves. A slow, agonizing realization began to dawn on her face. Julian, what is he talking about? He's confused, Evie, Julian said, stepping toward her. He's hallucinating. He's obsessed with some photos he thinks he saw. I didn't think I saw them, Evangeline, I yelled. They're in my study, on the drive. The drive is empty, Arthur, Jax said, holding up the silver USB Elena Vance had given me. He must have swiped it from my pocket when I burst into the room. He dropped it onto the floor and crushed it under the heel of his boot. There are no photos. There is no affair. There is only a tired old man who has lost his grip on reality. Evangeline looked at the crushed plastic on the rug. Then she looked at Sienna. She walked over to the other woman, her movements slow and deliberate. She reached out and grabbed Sienna's left hand, pulling it into the light. The vintage sapphire and diamond ring was gone. In its place was a fresh, pale band of skin. "Where is the ring, Sienna?" Evangeline asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "The one Cassidy gave you for your soul sister bond?" Sienna stammered, her eyes darting to Jax for help. I lost it. I took it off to wash my hands and—" "She didn't lose it," I said. "She was wearing it in the garden when she was kissing your husband." The slap echoed like a gunshot. Evangeline's hand caught Julian across the face with such force his head snapped back. "You pathetic, lying worm," she hissed. She turned to Cassidy. "And you knew? You helped him?" Cassidy didn't even flinch. "I helped the family, Evie. Something you were always too refined to do. Julian is an asset. Sienna is an asset. You're just a decoration. Now, be a good girl and sit down while the doctor does his job." "I'm calling the police," Evangeline said, reaching for her phone. In a flash, one of the guards grabbed her wrist, twisting the phone out of her hand. Evangeline let out a sharp cry of pain. "Let her go." I lunged forward, but the other guards were on me in an instant. They pinned my arms behind my back, forcing me down onto my knees. "Dr. Thorne," Cassidy said, her voice bored, "I think the assessment is complete. Clearly the sterling spine has finally snapped. Let's get the paperwork signed." Thorne nodded and opened his briefcase. He pulled out a document, the conservatorship mandate. It already had his signature on it. All it needed was a witness. "Wait," Jax said, looking at the monitor again. His brow furrowed. "That's strange." "What?" Cassidy snapped. "The server. It's not just mirroring." "It's transmitting," Jax said, his fingers flying across the keys. "There's a high bandwidth outbound signal. It's bypassing the New Jersey firm entirely. It's going to a Department of Justice IP. Silence fell over the library, a cold, heavy silence. "You said you had the manifests," Julian screamed at Sienna. "You said you encrypted the link." "I did," Sienna cried. "I don't know how." I looked up from the floor, my face pressed against the rug, and I started to laugh. It was a ragged, desperate sound, but it was filled with a triumph they couldn't understand. "I didn't know it yet," I gasped, looking at Cassidy's pale face, but my paranoia had a very specific backup plan. "What did you do, Arthur?" Jax snarled, grabbing me by the hair and pulling my head back. "I didn't hire an investigator to watch you." I spat. "I hired a whistleblower firm to watch me. I set up a dead man switch on my own servers. If my biometrics ever dropped, if my heart rate spiked and the vault locked, it didn't just send files to a drive. It sent a full confession of every gray market deal I've ever made to the SEC and the FBI, along with every keystroke Jax has made in the last hour." I looked at Julian, whose eyes were wide with terror. "Including the transfer of the headquarters deed, which, by the way, was a honeypot. That deed was a forgery I planted in the safe months ago. You just signed a confession of grand larceny and wire fraud to a federal server." Far off in the distance, past the manicured hedges and the wrought iron gates, I heard a sound that was sweeter than any music. The sirens. Real sirens. And they were getting closer. "We have to go." Julian panicked, turning for the door. "Cassidy, move." But Cassidy didn't move. She stood looking at me, her eyes burning with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. "You'd burn your own house down just to keep us from the chimney," she whispered. "I'd burn the whole world down," I replied, "before I let you turn my legacy into a graveyard." What happened next changed everything, because as the sirens wailed at the gates, Jax reached into his waistband and pulled out a heavy black handgun. He didn't point it at the guards. He didn't point it at the door. He pointed it straight at my heart. "Then I guess the dead man's switch is about to go live," he snarled. The cold weight of the gun barrel wasn't as heavy as the realization that my own daughter was standing there, watching it happen with the same indifference she'd show a smudge on her designer shoes. Jax's hand was steady. His gray eyes narrowed to slits. He wasn't a consultant anymore. He was a cornered animal with nothing to lose and a very expensive lifestyle to protect. "Put the gun down, Jax," I said, my voice sounding more like the CEO of Sterling Maritime than a man staring at his own death. "The sirens are at the gates. You shoot me, and you're not just a fraudster. You're a murderer on federal property. They'll bury you under the prison. They have to get through the gates first, Arthur." Jax sneered. "My men are at the perimeter. They have orders to hold the line until I get what I came for. Now, sign the mandate. Sign it, or I'll let Dr. Thorne write suicide on your death certificate, and we'll take the conservatorship anyway." I looked at Cassidy. "Is this what you wanted? A bloodbath in the library?" She tucked a stray hair behind her ear, her expression unreadable. "I wanted a clean transition, Dad. I wanted you to go quietly to a nice facility where you could spend your days looking at the ocean and forget about the company. But you always had to be the hero. You always had to be the smartest man in the room. This is on you. I didn't know it yet, but the smartest man in the room had made one fatal calculation error. I had assumed the mercenaries at the gate were just there for show. I hadn't realized that Jax Blackwood had spent 6 months draining my secondary payroll accounts to pay them a loyalty bonus that exceeded their annual salaries. They weren't just security, they were his private army. Suddenly, the library windows rattled. A flash of light erupted from the end of the driveway, followed by a muffled thump. "They're breaching the gate," Julian whimpered, his face ashen. He was huddled near the fireplace, looking less like a Newport prince and more like a frightened child. "Jax, we have to go. This wasn't the deal. You said no one would get hurt." "The deal changed when your wife started hitting people, Julian," Jax barked without looking away from me. "Thorne, get the paper. Move his hand if you have to." Dr. Thorne stepped forward, his cold eyes fixed on mine. He produced a fountain pen, a heavy, gold-nibbed thing that looked like an instrument of torture in this light. He reached for my right hand. The guards tightened their grip on my shoulders, forcing my chest against the mahogany desk. My face was pressed into the leather inlay, right next to the photograph of Eleanor. What happened next changed everything, I thought as I felt the cold metal of the pen being pressed into my palm. Evangeline screamed. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a roar of pure, sterling-bred fury. She lunged at Sienna, grabbing her by that fiery red hair and yanking her back with such force they both crashed into a bookshelf. Rare first editions tumbled around them, but Evangeline didn't care. She was a woman who had lost her husband, her pride, and her future in the span of an hour. She was looking for blood. "Get her off me!" Sienna shrieked, clawing at Evangeline's face. The distraction was enough. One of the guards turned his head, his grip loosening on my left arm for a fraction of a second. I didn't hesitate. I drove my elbow back into his solar plexus, feeling the air leave his lungs in a sharp grunt. I spun, grabbing the heavy brass paperweight from my desk, a scale model of the Sterling Empress, and swung it with every ounce of strength I had left. It connected with the side of Jax's head. The gun went off. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. A bullet shattered the antique clock on the mantel, sending shards of glass and brass gears flying like shrapnel. Jax stumbled back, blood blooming from a gash on his temple, the gun slipping from his fingers. I didn't go for the gun. I went for the terminal. "Cassidy, stop him!" Jax yelled, clutching his head. Cassidy lunged toward the desk, her face finally showing a flicker of emotion, pure, unadulterated desperation. She grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "You won't ruin this, Dad. You won't." "I'm not ruining it, Cassidy," I gasped, my fingers hovering over the emergency purge key. "I'm finishing it." I hit the button. The monitors in the room didn't just go black. They flickered with a bright, strobing white light. A high-pitched whine began to emanate from the walls, the sound of the high-intensity magnets I'd had installed in the server racks 10 years ago as a failsafe against industrial espionage. Every hard drive in the house was being wiped clean. Every bit of evidence Jax thought he had to prove my incompetence was being vaporized. But more importantly, every digital record of the Sterling Maritime assets was being encrypted with a key that only one person in the world possessed, and that person wasn't me. "What did you do?" I. Cassidy screamed, shaking my arm. "The accounts! Where are the accounts?" "They're gone, Cassidy," I said, leaning back against the desk as the room began to fill with the smell of ozone and burning electronics. "I transferred the entire principal of the Sterling Family Trust to a blind endowment 3 minutes ago. The beneficiary isn't you, it isn't Evangeline, it's the Maritime Seafarers Pension Fund." I looked at the woman who had once been my little girl. "You wanted the company for its liquidity. Well, the liquidity is gone. There's nothing left to sell. Sterling Maritime is now a non-profit entity managed by a board of federal trustees." The silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire. Even the guards stopped moving. The mercenaries at the gate were fighting for a prize that no longer existed. Jax looked at the blank screens, the blood from his head wound dripping onto his white shirt. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire world vanish into a digital void. "You killed it," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You killed the company." "No, Jax," I said. "I saved the families who work for it. I just killed your interest in it." The front doors of the mansion finally gave way. The sound of heavy boots echoed through the hall, followed by the authoritative shouts of federal agents. "FBI, nobody move! Hands in the air!" Julian collapsed to his knees, sobbing into his hands. Sienna crawled away from Evangeline, her face bruised and her dress torn. "Doctor." Thorne dropped his briefcase and raised his hands. The mask of professional coldness finally shattered. "But, Jax." Jax didn't raise his hands. He looked at the gun on the floor, then at me. "If I can't have the Empire," he snarled, "I'll at least have the satisfaction." He lunged for the weapon. I was too slow. I was an old man, exhausted and beaten down by the weight of my own failures. I closed my eyes, waiting for the final sound, but it didn't come. I opened my eyes to see Evangeline standing over Jax, the heavy brass ship model in her hand. She had struck him again, right across the back of the neck. He lay face down on the rug, motionless. "Nobody touches my father," she said, her voice shaking, but her eyes fixed on Cassidy. Cassidy stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the wreckage of her plan. She didn't look at the agents bursting into the room. She didn't look at Jax. She looked at me, and for a fleeting second, I saw a flash of the little girl who used to sit on my shoulders. Then, it was gone, replaced by a wall of cold, hard granite. "You think you won, Dad?" she whispered as an agent grabbed her arms and began to cuff her. "You're an old man in a big empty house. You have no company. You have no daughters. You're the king of a graveyard." "Maybe," I said, watching them lead her away. "But at least I'm not a tenant in yours." As the library cleared out, the agents began their work, tagging evidence and escorting the conspirators to the waiting vans. Evangeline stayed behind. She sat in the leather chair Julian had occupied earlier, her hands trembling in her lap. "Is it true, Daddy?" she asked softly. "Is it all gone?" "The money is gone, Evie," I said, walking over and putting a hand on her shoulder. "But the company will survive. The jobs will stay. I kept enough back in your mother's private estate, the one the Vanes couldn't find, to make sure you're taken care of. Not Kensington estate taken care of, but you'll never be hungry." She looked up at me, tears finally spilling over. "I was so stupid I let him in. I let them all in." "We both did, sweetheart," I said. "We both wanted to believe in the fairy tale." I looked out the window. The sun was starting to set over the Greenwich Hills, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold. The social event of the season was over. The Sterling name was dragged through the mud, and my family was in tatters. I didn't know it yet, but the hardest part of the journey was still ahead of me. Rock bottom wasn't the library floor or the gun to my chest. Rock bottom was the silence that was about to follow. As I watched the last of the black SUVs pull away, I felt a vibration in my pocket. I pulled out my phone. It was a text from an unknown number. "The dead man's switch was a nice touch, Arthur, but you forgot one thing. The Baltic Syndicate doesn't buy companies, they buy people, and you still have one debt left to pay." I felt the blood go cold in my veins. I looked at the security feed on the one monitor that hadn't been fried, the one tied to the perimeter gate. A single black car was parked just outside the property line. A man was leaning against the hood, a cigarette dangling from his lips. Even through the grainy footage, I recognized the silhouette. It was Silas Vane, Julian's father, the man the FBI was supposed to have arrested an hour ago. He looked directly at the camera, raised his hand, and made a cutting motion across his throat. What happened next changed everything. Because I realized then that the war wasn't over. It had just moved from the boardroom to the shadows. And I was standing in a house with no security, no money, and a daughter who was the only thing I had left to lose. I turned to Evangeline. "We have to leave. Right now." "What? Why? The police are here." "The police are gone, Evie," I said, pointing at the monitor. "And the monsters are still at the door." The sirens faded into the distance, leaving a silence so heavy it felt like the house itself was holding its breath. Evangeline stood in the center of the library, clutching a handful of tissues to her bruised face, looking at the wreckage of our family legacy. The FBI had taken the frontline players, Julian, Jax, Sienna, and my own daughter, Cassidy. They had the forged documents, the recorded keystrokes, and the scent of blood in the water. But as I stared at the monitor showing Silas Vane leaning against his black sedan at my front gate, I realized we hadn't won. We just cleared the stage for the real monster to enter. "Daddy, you said the police would protect us," Evangeline whispered, her voice trembling. "Why is he still there? Why didn't they take him?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was racing through 40 years of business deals, looking for the one crack Silas Vane had crawled through. I hadn't known it then, but my biggest mistake wasn't trusting Julian, it was underestimating the depth of the Vane family's desperation. They weren't just broke old money. They were a front for the Baltic Syndicate, a group that didn't care about stock prices or maritime law. They cared about the physical routes, the ghost lanes I'd spent decades mapping to avoid taxes and pirates. "Get your coat, Evie. We're leaving through the service tunnel," I said, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. "The tunnel? Dad, that hasn't been used since the 60s. It's probably collapsed. It's the only way out that isn't under a vein scope," I snapped. I grabbed a leather satchel from behind the false panel in my desk, the one Jax hadn't found. It contained 200,000 in cash, 3 Swiss passports, and a encrypted key fob that didn't look like much, but held the location of a private berth in New London. We hurried down to the cellar, the smell of damp earth and aged wine rising to meet us. As I pushed aside a heavy rack of dusty Cabernet to reveal the iron door of the service tunnel, my phone buzzed in my pocket. A private number. I knew who it was before I even looked. "Arthur," the voice was like grinding gravel. "Silas Vane, you always were a sentimental fool. You thought giving your money to a pension fund would save you. You just signed the death warrants for 10,000 sailors. The syndicate doesn't take non-profit for an answer. They want their interest, and they want it in blood. The feds have your son, Silas," I growled, stepping into the dark, cramped tunnel. "They have your Vane entity links. You're finished." Silas chuckled, a cold, dry sound that echoed in the receiver. "Julian is a disposable asset. So is Cassidy. Did you really think your own daughter was the mastermind? She's a bored socialite who wanted a bigger playground. I'm the one who built the fence, Arthur, and I'm the one who decides when the hunt ends. Check your daughter's private estate, the one you thought you kept hidden from us." I froze. The small fund I'd set aside for Evangeline, the one tied to her mother's maiden name. I hadn't even told my lawyers about it. "What did you do?" I whispered. "I didn't do anything," Silas said. "But your wife, Eleanor, she was a very clever woman. She knew you'd eventually lose your grip. She made me the secondary trustee of that account 20 years ago. The moment you moved the Sterling Trust into the pension fund, you triggered a total loss clause. Everything Eleanor left for the girls, it just defaulted to me." I felt the air leave my lungs. My knees hit the cold, damp stone of the tunnel floor. Evangeline gasped, reaching out to steady me. "Dad? What is it? What did he say?" "Leader," I couldn't speak. The hidden truth, the one that had been buried under 2 decades of mourning, hit me like a physical blow. Eleanor hadn't just died of a sudden illness. She had been protecting the girls from me. She'd seen the obsession, the sterling spine that would eventually crush everything it touched, and she had sought out a safeguard. She chose the Vanes because they were prestigious and, at the time, seemed stable. She had tried to create a check and balance for my power, never dreaming that the Vanes would rot from the inside out and become the very predators she was trying to avoid. "I'm coming for the house, Arthur," Silas said, his tone suddenly flat and businesslike. "And I'm coming for the girls. You have 1 hour to disappear. If you're still in Greenwich by sunset, I'll stop being a businessman and start being a Vane." The line went dead. I looked up at Evangeline. In the dim light of the tunnel, she looked so much like her mother it made my heart ache. I had spent my life building an empire to protect them, and in doing so, I had provided the very map the enemy used to destroy us. I had hit rock bottom. I had no company, no home, no money, and the memory of my late wife was now tainted by the realization that she hadn't trusted me with our children's future. "We're going to a motel, Evie," I said, my voice cracking. "A place where no one knows the name Sterling." The next 48 hours were a blur of cheap neon lights, stale cigarettes, and the kind of crushing poverty I hadn't felt since I was 20 years old. We were holed up in a roadside dive outside of Bridgeport, the Red Carpet Inn. It was a place of stained carpets and flickering fluorescent lights, a far cry from the marble halls of our estate. Evangeline sat on the edge of the bed, staring at a small television that only played static. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. I sat at the small, laminate desk, staring at the encrypted key fob. This was my last card. I hadn't told anyone, not even Eleanor, about the Black Fleet. 5 aging freighters, decommissioned on paper but fully operational, hidden in a private cove in northern Maine. They were the untraceable assets I'd kept for a day I hoped would never come. What happened next changed everything. I realized I couldn't fight Silas Vane with law or money. I had to fight him with the very thing I'd spent 40 years pretending I didn't possess, the ruthlessness of a man who has nothing left to lose. "Evie," I said, turning to her, "do you remember when you were 10 and I told you that a sterling never sinks, that we just learn how to breathe underwater?" She looked at me, her eyes red-rimmed but curious. I remember. Well, it's time to start holding your breath, I said. We're not running anymore. We're going to Maine, and I'm going to show Silas Vane what happens when you try to steal a ghost. I didn't know it yet, but the dead man's switch I'd triggered at the office had a secondary function I hadn't even told the feds about. It didn't just send files. It started a countdown. A countdown that would systematically lock every Vane-controlled port in the Atlantic within 72 hours. Silas thought he was seizing my assets, but he was actually walking into a cage of his own making. But I needed a way to deliver the final blow. I needed an inside man. Or, more accurately, an inside woman. I picked up the burner phone I'd bought at a gas station and dialed a number I'd memorized 10 years ago. It wasn't a lawyer. It wasn't an investigator. It was Elena Vance, the photographer. "Arthur?" She answered on the first ring, her voice tight with fear. "The news. They're saying you've disappeared. That the feds are looking for you for questioning about the pension fund transfer." "Let them look, Elena," I said. "I need you to do something for me, something dangerous. Do you still have the raw files from the wedding? The ones I didn't see?" I have everything, Arthur. But why?" "Because Julian Vane is a coward, but he's also a narcissist," I said. "I need you to find the shots of him with his father, not the ones in the garden, the ones in the study before the ceremony. I saw a flash of something on his cuff. A very specific tattoo, a syndicate mark." "Arthur, if I get caught with that..." "You won't," I promised. "I'm sending a car for you. Don't go home. Go to the New London berth. I'm going to dismantle Silas Vane, Elena, and I'm going to use his own blood to do it." I hung up and looked at Evangeline. The fear in her eyes was being replaced by something else, something harder, something sterling. "What's the plan, Dad?" she asked. "The plan is simple, sweetheart," I said, standing up and grabbing the satchel. "Silas Vane thinks he's playing a game of chess, but I'm about to turn the board into a shipwreck. We're going to find your sister, Cassidy, but she betrayed us. She tried to kill you." "She's a sterling Evie," I said, a cold smile touching my lips. "And right now she's sitting in a federal holding cell realizing that Silas Vane left her behind to rot. She's not an enemy anymore, she's the key. And I'm going to make her an offer she can't refuse." What happened next changed everything. I wasn't just a father anymore. I was a commander. And the war for the sterling name was about to move from the boardroom to the deep, dark water where the Vanes couldn't swim. As we pulled out of the motel parking lot, a black SUV pulled in behind us. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I didn't speed up. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the driver. It wasn't a Vane mercenary, it was Miller, my investigator. He looked at me, gave a single sharp nod, and veered off in the opposite direction, drawing the shadow away from us. He hadn't flipped. He'd been playing the double agent the whole time. "I didn't know it yet," I whispered as we hit the highway toward Maine. "But the real revenge hasn't even started, and Silas Vane is about to find out that a sterling always keeps his receipts." I turned off the headlights and disappeared into the night. The collapse was over. The reversal was beginning, and by the time the sun rose over the Maine coastline, the Vane family would realize they hadn't just stolen a company, they'd woken up a titan. The air in northern Maine doesn't just get cold, it gets heavy, smelling of salt, pine needle decay, and the metallic tang of old iron. We arrived at Deadman's Cove at 3 in the morning, the fog so thick it felt like we were driving through a bale of damp wool. Evangeline was asleep against the passenger window, her breath fogging the glass, looking younger and more vulnerable than she had in years. I killed the engine of the beat-up truck I'd swapped the Mercedes for in New Hampshire and just sat there, listening to the ticking of the cooling metal. I looked at my hands. They were trembling. For 40 years, these hands had signed billion-dollar contracts and steered the fate of thousands of employees. Now, they were stained with the grease of a roadside engine repair and the dirt of a service tunnel. I had lost the house. I had lost the company. I had lost one daughter to greed and the other to a heartbreak I'd indirectly funded. I was at the bottom of the ocean, the pressure of Silas Vane's world crushing the life out of me. I didn't know it yet, but the Black Fleet wasn't just my fallback plan. It was my penance. I shook Evangeline awake gently. "We're here, sweetheart." She sat up, rubbing her eyes, squinting through the windshield at the dark, jagged shapes rising out of the water. "Is that them? They look like ghosts." "They are ghosts, Evie," I said. "And ghosts are the only ones who can walk through walls." We walked down to the rotting wooden pier where a man was waiting, his silhouette framed by the amber glow of a kerosene lantern. Captain Elias Vance, no relation to Elena or Julian, just an old sea dog who had been on my private payroll for 25 years to keep these ships from being turned into razor blades. Arthur, Elias rumbled, his voice like two stones grinding together. I saw the news. They're saying you're a fugitive. They're saying the Sterling name is dead. The name is alive as long as these engines turn, Elias, I said, stepping onto the pier. Are they ready? The Cynthia May and the Braxton have full heads of steam. The other three need 12 hours. But Arthur, the feds are watching the coast. And Silas Vane's people are patrolling the lanes with ex-Navy hardware. You go out there, you're not just a fugitive, you're a target. I've been a target my whole life, Elias. I'm just tired of hiding behind a desk. I spent the next 6 hours in the belly of the Cynthia May, the flagship of my ghost fleet. It wasn't a luxury yacht or a high-tech freighter. It was a 1970s-era hull with a modern heart engines I'd replaced in secret, encryption arrays that could spoof a naval destroyer, and a hold that was currently empty but wouldn't stay that way for long. While Evangeline helped Elias's crew prep the rations, I used the satellite link to place a call to the federal holding facility in Danbury. It cost me $50,000 through a middleman to get 10 minutes on an unmonitored line to cell block C. Hello? The voice was thin, stripped of its usual arrogance. Cassidy, I said. Silence. A long, jagged silence. Dad? I'm here. I thought you were dead. Or gone. Silas said the syndicate would take care of you. Her voice broke, a genuine sob catching in her throat. He left me here, Dad. He told the lawyers I was the primary conspirator. He's pinning the whole Vane entity on me. I know, I said, my heart hardening. He used you, Cassidy. He used your resentment of me to turn you into a fall girl. You were never his partner. You were his insurance policy. Dad, I'm so sorry, she whispered. I didn't know about the syndicate. I just wanted to be free of your shadow. You're in a much darker shadow now, Cassidy, but I'm going to give you a choice. I'm going to send an attorney to see you. A man named Harrison Thorne, doctor. Thorne's brother, actually. He's been waiting for a chance to ruin his sibling for years. You're going to give him the decryption keys to the Vane entity's secondary ledger, the one Julian kept in his private watch box. Julian has a ledger? Every narcissist keeps a record of his wins, Cassidy. Julian is no different. Those keys will prove Silas was the architect. It will clear your name of the federal charges, but you'll still lose everything else. No trust fund, no Sterling name, no Greenwich house. You'll be starting from zero. I don't care, she said, her voice finally finding a shred of the Sterling spine. I just want to see Silas Vane burn. Then do exactly what Harrison tells you, and Cassidy, don't ever contact me again. This isn't a rescue, it's a transaction. I hung up before she could respond. My chest felt like it was filled with broken glass. I had just traded my daughter's freedom for the weapon I needed to kill a monster. It was the most Sterling thing I'd ever done, and I hated myself for it. What happened next changed everything, because as I stepped back onto the deck, the morning light hitting the cold Atlantic, Miller called me. Arthur, you need to see this. I'm sending a live feed to your tablet. It's from the Greenwich house. I opened the file. Silas Vane wasn't just sitting in my house, he was dismantling it. He had a crew of men in the library, my library, with sledgehammers. They weren't looking for money. They were tearing down the oak paneling, ripping up the floorboards. What are they looking for, Miller? They're looking for the Sterling archive, Arthur. Silas found a reference to it in Eleanor's old journals. He thinks you have the physical deeds to the ghost lanes, the original maritime grants from the 1800s. If he gets those, he doesn't need your company. He becomes the law of the Atlantic. I looked at the screen, watching a man swing a hammer into the spot where Eleanor's portrait used to hang. My blood ran cold. The archive didn't exist. It was a story I'd told Eleanor to make the business seem more romantic, more like a legacy and less like a ledger. But Silas believed it. He was so consumed by his own greed that he was chasing a ghost. Let him dig, Miller, I said, a slow, predatory grin spreading across my face. In fact, I want you to leak a clue to him. Tell his people that the archive is hidden in the hull of the Sterling Empress, my first ship, the one that's currently being decommissioned in the New London Yard. Arthur, that's a trap. He'll send everything he has to that yard. Exactly, I said. And while he's looking for paper in a rusted hull, the Black Fleet is going to hit his syndicate supply lines in the mid-Atlantic. We're going to take his liquidity, Miller. We're going to bleed him dry in the one place he thinks he's king. I turned to Evangeline, who was standing at the rail, her hair whipping in the wind. She looked at me, and for the first time, I didn't see a victim. I saw the daughter of a privateer. "We're going to sea, Evie," I said. "Are we coming back, Dad?" "We're coming back for what's ours," I said. "But the people we were? They're staying in the fog." I didn't know it yet, but Silas Vane had already made his move. He hadn't just stayed in Greenwich. He had moved Eleanor's remains. He had taken her casket from the family vault and moved it to an undisclosed location. The text came through as the Cynthia May cleared the cove, a photo of an empty grave. "A fair trade, Arthur," the message read. "The archive for the wife. You have 48 hours to meet me at the New London Yard. Bring the deeds, or Eleanor stays lost forever." The roar that ripped from my throat was a sound I didn't know a human could make. It wasn't grief. It was the sound of the final restraint snapping. Silas Vane had reached into the ground to hurt me. He had crossed a line that even the syndicate wouldn't go near. "Elias!" I screamed, the wind tearing at my words. "Full steam, we're not going to the mid-Atlantic, we're going to New London, and we're going to turn that shipyard into a funeral pyre." I looked at the empty grave on my phone screen, my vision blurring with a white-hot rage. I had hit rock bottom, and then Silas Vane had started digging. What happened next changed everything, because I realized then that I didn't want my company back. I didn't want my house back. I wanted Silas Vane to feel the weight of every life he'd destroyed, and I wanted him to feel it as the water closed over his head. "The hunt is over," I whispered to the cold Main Sea. "The war is here." The New London shipyard loomed out of the Atlantic mist like the ribcage of a dead leviathan. It was a place of rusted cranes, screaming gulls, and the skeletal remains of ships that had once conquered the world. I stood on the bridge of the Cynthia May, my hands steady on the rail, watching the silhouette of the Sterling Empress, the first ship I ever owned, moored at Pier 9. Silas Vane was there. I could see the black SUVs lined up like a funeral procession, their headlights cutting through the gray gloom. Beside me, Evangeline was a shadow in a heavy peacoat. She hadn't spoken since we left Maine. She didn't need to. The sterling spine was back, tempered by the fire of betrayal. She wasn't the socialite who wanted a $12 million estate anymore. She was the girl who had seen the bottom of the ocean and decided she liked the dark. "Elias, cut the engines," I whispered into the comms. "We drift in. Low profile. Keep the Braxton and the others 500 yards out. When I give the word, I want every floodlight in the fleet focused on Pier 9. Make it look like the sun just fell out of the sky." "Copy that, Arthur," Elias rumbled. "Godspeed." I lowered myself into a small skiff, the cold spray hitting my face. I carried the manila envelope Silas wanted the Sterling archive. To the world, it looked like the weight of a legacy. To me, it felt like the fuse of a bomb. I rowed toward the pier, the rhythmic dip of the oars, the only sound in the eerie quiet. Silas was waiting at the edge of the dock, standing next to a shipping crate draped in a white tarp, the casket. My heart constricted, a sharp, stabbing pain that nearly knocked the wind out of me. To use a man's wife against him, it was a level of depravity that even the syndicate usually avoided. I climbed onto the dock, my boots echoing on the wet timber. Silas looked exactly the same as he did at the wedding, impeccable charcoal suit, silver hair perfectly coiffed, a smile that was nothing more than a well-managed scar. Behind him, Julian stood like a ghost, his face hollow, his eyes darting toward the darkness of the water. He knew he was standing on a trapdoor. "You're late, Arthur," Silas said, his voice carrying over the lap of the waves. "I was starting to think you'd lost your nerve, that the sterling spine had finally turned to jelly." "I was busy making sure the archive was complete, Silas," I said, holding up the envelope. "It's all here. The original grants, the private coordinates, the keys to the Atlantic. But first, show me the girl." Silas gestured to the white tarp. One of his men stepped forward and pulled it back. The polished mahogany of Eleanor's casket gleamed under the pier lights. It looked so small out here, in the cold and the dirt. "She's fine, Arthur. Resting as peacefully as ever," Silas sneered. "Now, the papers." I walked forward, every step feeling like I was walking through deep mud. I reached the center of the pier and stopped. I didn't hand him the envelope. I dropped it on the ground between us. "Check them. Make sure they're what you want." Silas nodded to Julian. The boy scurried forward, his hands shaking as he tore open the envelope. He pulled out the heavy, vellum pages documents I'd spent 48 hours forging with the help of a retired syndicate counterfeiter Elias knew in Portland. They looked ancient. They looked real. They were covered in signatures and seals that hadn't been used in a century. "It's them," Julian whispered, his eyes wide. "Dad, these are the original charters. These are the ghost lanes." Silas stepped forward, a look of pure, ecstatic greed on his face. He reached for the papers, his fingers trembling. He was so close. He was a man who had spent his life chasing the prestige he'd inherited and lost, and now he thought he had finally surpassed me. He thought he was the new king of the sea. "I told you, Arthur," Silas said, looking up from the documents. "You were always a sentimental fool. You gave up the greatest maritime secret in history for a box of bones." "I didn't give up anything, Silas," I said, and my voice was as cold as the water beneath us. "Because Eleanor isn't in that box." Silas froze. "What?" "I didn't know it yet back at the wedding," I said, stepping closer to him. "But I've known you were a predator for 20 years. You think I'd leave the woman I loved in a vault you had the secondary keys to? I moved her the day after I signed the secondary trustee paperwork. The grave you dug up in Greenwich was empty, Silas. It was filled with nothing but concrete and a very specific electronic trigger." The color drained from Silas's face. He looked at the casket, then back at me. "You're lying." "Open it," I challenged. "Go ahead. See for yourself." Silas lunged for the tarp, tearing it away. He hammered on the lid, forcing it open. It was empty, not even a shroud. Just a polished interior and a small black box wired into the base. "The Sterling Archive isn't a map of ghost lanes, Silas," I said. "It's a digital ledger of every cent the Vane family has laundered for the syndicate in the last decade, and the moment you opened that lid, you completed the circuit. You didn't just find a ledger, you just broadcast your live location and a full confession of your intent to the FBI's Major Crimes Division, along with a little something for the syndicate." "The syndicate?" Julian gasped, his voice a high-pitched whine. "They don't like it when their partners get sloppy, Julian," I said. "And they really don't like it when their partners lead the feds straight to their primary supply docks." I raised my hand and signaled. Suddenly, the night exploded. 6 massive floodlights from the Cynthia May and the rest of the Black Fleet ignited at once, pinning Pier 9 inches of blinding, white glare. Silas and his men shielded their eyes, stumbling back. From the water, the roar of high-speed engines approached the Coast Guard, flanked by 2 federal interceptors. What happened next changed everything. I thought, watching the panic set in. Julian tried to run, but he tripped over the forged documents, the ghost lanes fluttering into the water like dead leaves. Silas stood his ground, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He reached into his jacket for a weapon, but he was too slow. A red laser dot appeared on the center of his forehead. "Drop it, Vane," a voice boomed over a megaphone. "FBI, stay where you are." I didn't stay. I walked to the edge of the pier, where my skiff was waiting. Evangeline was there, helping me down. I didn't look back as the agents swarmed the dock, tackling Silas to the ground, his designer suit finally getting the dirt it deserved. I didn't look back as they dragged Julian away, screaming about how he'd cooperated. We rowed back to the Cynthia May in silence. As we climbed onto the deck, the sun began to break over the horizon, a pale, cold sliver of gold. The war was over. The Vanes were finished. Cassidy was safe in a way, cleared of the worst charges but permanently exiled from the world she'd tried to steal. She would be working in a diner in Ohio by next month, living a life of anonymity that was the only mercy I could offer her. I walked to the stern of the ship and looked out at the New London skyline. I had no house. I had no company. I had a daughter who looked at me with a mix of respect and fear that would never truly go away. I had a ghost fleet and a bank account in Switzerland that would keep us comfortable but never powerful. I was an old man, and I was finally, truly, free. "Daddy?" Evangeline asked, coming up behind me. "Where are we going now?" I looked at the horizon. "South, Evie. Somewhere where the water is warm and the names don't matter. We're going to find a place where a sterling can just be a person." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small, gold-nibbed pen Dr. Thorne had tried to force into my hand. I looked at it for a moment, then tossed it into the wake of the ship. I watched it sink, a tiny glint of gold disappearing into the endless blue. "I didn't know it yet," I whispered, "but the best part of the story isn't the revenge. It's the silence that comes after." The moral of the story was one I had learned too late, but clearly enough. You can build a fortress out of gold and a legacy out of iron, but if you don't build a foundation out of truth, the sea will always take it back. I had spent 40 years being Arthur Sterling, the Titan of the East. Now I was just Arthur. And as the Cynthia May turned toward the open ocean, I realized that Arthur was finally enough. I walked into the galley to make a pot of coffee. The beans were cheap, the water was hard, and the stove was temperamental. It was the best cup of coffee I'd ever had. I sat at the small table, looking at the map of the world. Not the ghost lanes, not the shipping routes, just the world. It was big, and it was beautiful, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to own any of it. I was just passing through, and that was the greatest victory of all.